You stand at the edge of a clearing before dawn. Smoke from a dozen bivouacs threads the air. Horses stamp and nicker in the half-light. Somewhere ahead, a line of wooden points catches the first thin blade of sun and turns it into a geometry of shadow. You can feel the cold on your face, the grit of the road underfoot, and for a moment the world is only the small human noises of a camp waking. Then the shape of the stakes reads like a sentence written across the land, and the sentence is punishment. If you find this investigation valuable, stay to the end and subscribe for more careful historical reconstructions. Years earlier, as a boy, he had learned by watching. Vlad III, later known by histories and rumor as the Impaler, had been taken into Ottoman custody as a political pledge in the precarious exchange between Wallachia's princes and the Sultan. Contemporary accounts and later chroniclers differ on the precise dates and the tenor of those years. Most historians place his captivity in the 1440s, roughly from early adolescence into his late teens. In an Ottoman milieu of courtly discipline, military spectacle, and stern forms of authority, the young hostage observed ceremonies of power that were at once ornate and ruthless. He watched how small insults were answered with public rebuke, how obedience was manufactured through ritual humiliation, and how the Sultan's household used spectacle to compress political messages into images almost impossible to ignore. Those lessons did not remain abstract. When Vlad returned to Wallachia after failed alliances and shifting fortunes, he brought back more than a claim to his patrimony. He carried a template for ordering society by fear, an operational theory that treated terror as a form of governance and a tactic of statecraft. To understand the fate of Ottoman prisoners in his hands is therefore to follow the architecture of a system. What he saw in the capital, what he amplified, how he engineered message and method, and how environments, roads, passes, campgrounds, markets were turned into instruments of control. The accounts of what followed mix eyewitness report, enemy propaganda, and later sensationalization. A German pamphlet that circulated in mid-century described columns of stakes surrounding the approach to Targovishte. A Byzantine chronicler sketched the shock the spectacle produced among visiting Ottoman envoys. Saxon merchants wrote of trade routes disrupted by fear. Modern historians debate numbers. How many were impaled? How many were prisoners versus deserters? And caution that wartime rumor tended to multiply horror for political effect. Even so, the pattern across sources is consistent. Vlad weaponized visibility. Vlad's methods were deliberate and technical. Impalement, as practiced in his campaigns, was not a matter of chaotic cruelty, but of engineering a public demonstration. Vlad's later years, marked by exile, return, and a violent end in 1476, whose details are disputed, though his death and the transmission of his head to Mehmed are accepted in broad outline, suggest an arc in which terror consolidates short-term control but undermines long-term sustainability. Empires and principalities that lean on terror alone tend to see the pool of loyalty shrink. The human toll must be kept central amid analysis. Prisoners were not merely variables in a strategic equation. They were sons, brothers, laborers, soldiers with names and networks that outlived them. When a captive vanished into the spectacle, families lost income and social standing. Networks of trade were interrupted. A region's population balance was altered.
Chroniclers who recorded details, some because they wanted to denounce Vlad, others because they intended to awe, occasionally preserved individual stories. A courier captured on a mountain pass, a merchant taken from a caravan. These vignettes, even if flattened by time, remind us that the political calculus had intimate human consequences. There is a methodological caution here. Some narratives of Vlad's cruelty rest on enemy exaggeration, others on later fascination with horror. Modern historians, therefore, triangulate across Ottoman registers, Wallachian documents, and Western pamphlets, reading each source for both fact and bias. When a Saxon pamphlet insists on numbers that sound grotesque, scholars ask what purpose the pamphleteer served. When an Ottoman report notes an unusual measure, historians ask whether the Sultan's court would have aired such a story if it suggested imperial vulnerability. The Forest of the Impaled, then, exists both as a documented strategic choice and as a symbol whose proportions were stretched and re-stretched by competing narrators. Technically, converting prisoners into political signs required infrastructure. A campaign to impale not only needed stakes, but labor, guarded construction sites, and a supply line preserved from sabotage. Vlad's administration thus organized cruelty with an almost bureaucratic logic. Orders were given, men were assigned to construct and maintain the fields of stakes, local officials were tasked with rounding up suspects. That administrative aspect, harsh, methodical, mundane, is chilling precisely because it makes atrocity routine. When violence becomes a regime of procedures, it acquires durability. Yet terror as governance depends on credibility. The sheer spectacle of a stake field had to be maintained. Weather, decay, and the passage of seasons could erode its impact. Vlad ensured that stakes were replaced, that their arrangement remained legible, that travelers encountered them at critical thresholds. He also varied his punishments. Not every offender suffered the same fate, and the threat of an impaling worked more effectively when paired with lesser, more frequent penalties.
This calibration turned fear into a lever rather than a blunt instrument. When we assess the fate of Ottoman prisoners under Vlad, therefore, we must read three registers at once. The tactical, how a man with limited manpower used terrain and surprise to offset an opponent. The administrative, how discipline and procedure made terror sustainable for a time. And the symbolic, how the visible suffering of captives served as an index to power. The interplay among these registers explains not only what happened in the field, but why the stories endured. In the end, Vlad's legacy poses a question historians ask of many such figures. Can the use of terror ever be justified as a form of statecraft without eroding the very foundations it seeks to protect? His answers, if they were ever coherent beyond expediency, were written in stakes and in the patterns of loyalty they produced and destroyed. The Ottoman prisoners who faced him became unwillingly readers of a political text in which violence translated into order. That translation produced immediate results: deterrence, short-term consolidation, and the staggering of enemies. It also produced long-term costs: exile, betrayal, and an afterlife in which the man's deeds were amplified into myth. The narrative that begins with a soldier's approach to a field of stakes ends with historians sitting at desks weighing bias, and with descendants of those times interpreting images for new audiences. The stakes are gone, the geography has shifted, but the mechanism of converting human suffering into political message remains legible.
To study it is to confront an enduring truth about power. When the cost of opposition becomes not only defeat but spectacle, politics bleeds into theater, and the audience is left with an uneasy understanding that some rulers prefer to govern by fear rather than by consent. If the field of stakes once served as a readable script in a landscape, its afterlife is written in different media, in depositions and ledgers that record numbers, in leather-bound chronicles that dramatize details, in travelogues that translate shock into moral lesson, in lullabies and folktales that fold a ruler's name into local memory. Each medium reenacts the original conversion, the human body made into message, yet each also reshapes meaning. A notary's tally insists on arithmetic. A Saxon pamphleteer inflates for rhetorical effect. An Ottoman dispatch frames the episode within frontier logic. A Wallachian chronicle laments or lauds according to allegiance. The historian who reconstructs the scene must move among these texts like an archaeologist among stratified deposits, teasing out which layer belongs to immediate administration, which to propagandistic repurposing, which to later imaginative accretion. That methodological care matters because legacy is not merely additive.
To invoke Vlad as exemplar of terror is not only to diagnose a past tactic, but to participate in a conversation about power. In early modern Europe, descriptions of Eastern cruelty were harnessed to draw civilizational boundaries. A pamphlet that dwelled on impalement did service beyond news. It warned, astonished, and morally affirmed the reader's home polity as more humane by contrast. Centuries later, when national histories sought figures to embody resistance and order amid foreign domination, reinterpretations followed another vector. The same excesses that Western broadsides cast as monstrous could, in national mythologies, be reframed as uncompromising defense, rough justice against invasion. Thus, Vlad's corpus of acts migrated across moral universes, an ambivalence crystallized in his two names. One a patronymic claiming lineage, the other a sobriquet that branded him with the instrument of terror. The material traces that might confirm or deny stories are frustratingly scant. Wood rot and riverine erosion devour the physical markers that once made a spectacle legible. Excavations can locate fortifications and fireplaces, carbon date huts and kitchens, but they rarely reveal the staging of an act designed to be seen and not preserved. Where archaeology can help, it does so by setting parameters. Population densities that sustain or preclude large-scale internments, supply routes enabling the feeding and guarding of prisoners, patterns of settlement that make ambushes feasible. Even then, the archaeological record is mute on intention. It cannot tell whether a stake was meant primarily as punishment or primarily as performance. It can only suggest which readings are plausible. That epistemic limitation forces historians to attend to politics of evidence. A 15th century chronicle that supplies lurid numbers must be read not only for what it reports, but for what it is trying to accomplish within its rhetorical economy. A sultan's courier who mentions an unusual measure signals something about court anxieties as much as about battlefield facts. In the absence of incontrovertible physical proof, triangulation becomes moral practice, weighing motives, contexts, and possible gains from exaggeration. This is how the Forest of the Impaled survives as both historical event and political trope. The effects of governing by spectacle, moreover, are not symmetrical. In the short term, displays can cohere obedience.
A passerby who sees a line of stakes may retrace his steps and report home. Rumor amplifies the intended lesson. But terror corrodes the same social tissues it seeks to bind. When authority rests on the credible threat of extreme pain, loyalty becomes conditional and brittle. Allies stay out of fear, not affection. Subordinates calculate survival rather than common purpose.
Em museus, instruções para síntese de fala. Eu sou narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Read between noble prince and monstrous predator". Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Em museus e guias de passagem, seletivas acentuam uma particular orientação. Rélicas de batalha podem estar em primeiro plano em vez de continuidade doméstica, ou testemunhos comprimidos em emblemáticas linhas. Turismo rediz em imagens porque espetáculo vende. O mercado de memória comodifica o estranho, often at odds with the sober task of historical accounting. Yet, within those tensions emerges a persistent curiosity about proportionality, about whether cruelty ever yields sustainable order. The empirical answer is mixed. In some contexts, theatrical severity bought time, protected borders, and consolidated authority long enough for more durable institutions to form. In others, it invited cycles of revenge, undermined recruitment, and left governance dependent on fear. Reading Vlad within that spectrum resists both hagiography and caricature. At dusk, a scholar closes the ledger and lights a lamp. The light catches the edges of maps folded into one another, a scribble marking a mountain pass, a margin note about a caravan, a transcription of a Saxon broadside. In the lamplight, the sources look less like enemies and more like interlocutors, each offering a partial vantage shaped by allegiance, audience, and rhetorical intent. The work then is practical humility, to assemble a narrative that honors evidence without succumbing to the seduction of spectacle, to let the human particulars, names, familial ties, the smell of smoke on a winter morning, anchor an analysis that might otherwise drift into abstraction. Beyond the study and the archive, the moral question persists in the public realm. How do communities remember rulers whose deeds resist tidy classification? How do museums and memorials navigate the line between education and sensationalism? How do writers and filmmakers borrow from historical terror without replicating its cruelty for effect? These questions are not simply about fidelity to facts, they are about the ethics of representation, the responsibility to those silenced by the spectacle, and to future readers who will inherit a past refracted through many lenses. If the stakes themselves have long since decayed, their echo continues to shape how we think about power. In the next field, be it a fortified pass, a council chamber, or a bookshop, the imprint of spectacle as policy will be recognized, debated, imitated, and resisted. To study that imprint is to keep the conversation between past and present honest, to insist that the means of order cannot be separated from the ends they produce, and that the moral calculus of governance carries consequences beyond immediate security. The scholar lets the lamp gutter, thoughtful. The ledger is shut, its ribbons tucked between entries as if to keep them from flapping into one another. He thinks of the faces that never made it into the ledger, neighbors whose names were scrawled and then effaced by time, servants whose voices survive only in the margins of minutes, a child's grave marked by nothing more than a hollow in the snow. To account for leaders and policies is necessary. To account for absence is a moral task of another order.
It is what compels him, night after night, to cross from the registers of power into the small, stubborn archives of ordinary life. Memory, he knows, is not a single thing, but a knot of practices. There are family altars where candle smoke strings the years. There are press releases and centennial plaques. There are the glossy pages of travel brochures and the darker shelves of nationalist historiography. Each of these mediates the past differently. Some pronounce and seal verdicts. Others bargain and hedge. A local historian in a provincial town might insist on a lineage of resistance. A guide in the capital will sell the spectacle because tourists tip in cash. Neither is purely truthful, and neither is wholly mendacious. Both convert history into present advantage, moral capital, economic gain, prestige. Consider museum choices. A curator's decision about whether to display a blade, a collar, a ledger of taxes is not neutral. The arrangement of objects constructs a geometry of meaning. A skeleton behind glass can become a warning or an emblem. A map with trade routes emphasized can speak of pragmatic statecraft rather than predation. In one exhibition hall, the emphasis is on defensive works and legal ordinances. In another, the room is darkened for atmosphere, with dramatic lighting on weapons and a soundtrack that pulses to a grotesque rhythm. The former invites comprehension, the latter performs dread. The choice often depends on audiences and funders, as much as on scholarly intent. Municipal grants, private donors, the taste of foreign visitors. Ethical curation, then, requires more than good captions. It requires a conscious refusal to let theatricality eclipse context. Equally fraught is the arena of popular fiction. A novelist or filmmaker samples from archives, but then reconditions the raw materials into mnemonic shorthand. A peripheral anecdote, an execution on a frozen plain, a ransom note carved with a foreign script, can be elevated into emblematic truth. The result is a compound in public memory, mythic archetype plus serialized entertainment. Authors are not innocent here. They choose the fragment that will strike the reader, and by doing so, they edit the many-sided past into an alluring but partial story. The scholar's task is not to despise such works, but to read them as actors in a competition for the past, evidence of what societies wish to see in their forebears, and thus evidence about the present no less than the past. Politics shapes this competition decisively. States write schoolbooks and sanction certain narratives while suppressing others. He crosses the threshold and finds the street lit by sodium lamps and neon. A different kind of illumination, but one that throws destinies into harsh relief. Tour groups thread between monuments. A bus hisses by, its windows fogged. A young couple argue about where to eat, their accents braided from city dialects. On the corner, beneath a plaque commemorating a long-vanished skirmish, a vendor sells souvenir postcards that reduce a complex history to a single lurid image. The scholar pauses, watching how people move past layers of memory as if through a palimpsest. Some glance at the plaques. Most glance through them, toward their selfies, their itineraries. A child runs ahead, calling a name that might be a local saint or a character from a novel. Laughter spills, raw and unbidden. The scene reminds him that pasts are not only contested by institutions, they are lived by people who carry them like clothing, sometimes comfortable, sometimes frayed. To study history without attending to that living inheritance is to risk irrelevance. He moves on toward the old gate where once a council met to pronounce law. The stones there are worn smooth by generations, and in their grooves the scholar reads no simple narrative, but an archive of usage. Where carts turned, where markets clustered, where protesters once gathered. Outside a cafe, a small poster advertises a lecture about the principality's founder, promising untold secrets. The title is sensational, the lecturer is reputable. The friction between these two, scholarship and spectacle, has become the defining tension of his work. Inside the cafe, patrons argue, quietly edged with certainties. A retired teacher speaks of textbooks, insisting that children should know the unsentimental truth. A tour guide retorts that tourists want feeling, and that pays wages. An elderly woman folds her hands and says simply that her grandfather used to say names softly, as if lowering them by a tone would keep the memory tidy. The scholar listens, and for the first time that night feels less like a judge and more like an interlocutor. History, he realizes anew, is not only a problem for experts, it is also a civic conversation in which many voices have rightful place. He returns to his lodging with these voices in his ears. The ledger will be reopened tomorrow. The maps will be refolded in different patterns as new questions arrive. Yet tonight there is one decision he sets aside from method. He will teach his students not merely to know the past, but to attend to how its images are made and sold. He will ask them to name the costs of spectacle and the humanities of restraint. He will ask them to cultivate an ethic of narration that recognizes the weight of every choice about emphasis and omission. Beyond pedagogy, there is action.
He compiles in his head modest proposals, community exhibits that pair objects with oral testimony, school visits that encourage critical reading of guidebook claims, museum labels that confess uncertainty rather than mask it. These are small practices, but their accumulation might shift how a civic landscape remembers, less by decree and more by conversation. The prospect is not utopian. It can be painfully incremental, but it is the only viable alternative to the wholesale commodification or the wholesale damnation of the past. As he puts the lamp out, a distant clock tolls the hour. Memory, like time, keeps moving. His work, like that clock, will continue to chime in patterns both predictable and surprising. He thinks of the ledger's last line, a brief note about an execution that once took place near a ford. Not heroic, not merely criminal, but entwined with tax disputes and fugitive bands and the town's winter hunger. If one thing holds across centuries, it is the fact that human motives are tangled and that cruelty seldom exists in elegant isolation. To remember that is not to absolve or to vilify. It is to insist on complexity as a moral duty. Outside, a tour group rounds the corner, chanting the name that sells tickets. The scholar steps toward the window and watches the chant dissolve into the night. He does not stop it, nor should he, but he also does not let it stand unremarked. He writes a marginal note in the ledger. Attend to the tour routes. Document the postcards. It is a small, practical injunction,
The work of disentangling spectacle from responsibility proceeds in such modest acts, cataloging, contextualizing, insisting that every exhibit and every lecture carry with it an acknowledgement of those who do not profit from notoriety. He closes the notebook and for a moment imagines a town where plaques do more than glorify, where they tell stories, including those that unsettle. He imagines children reading them aloud in schoolyards, their voices stumbling over awkward truths, and, in that stumbling, learning the shape of moral complexity. It is an image simple enough to mock. It is, for him, the measure of what historians can hope to change. The lamp is out. The city continues to hum. He rises, gathers his papers, and resolves to begin again tomorrow from the same place of careful skepticism and humane attention, because the past, when left only to spectacle, ceases to teach. He slips the ledger into a satchel and steps into the corridor, the night air at the threshold carrying a chorus of disparate claims. Guidebooks, family stories, municipal brochures, scholarly footnotes. Each will have its turn. Each will need to be held to account. He closes the door behind him and walks into the street where the tour group is dispersing, the souvenirs clutched in willing hands, history transacted in coin and story alike. He does not join them.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: In coin and story alike, he does not join them. Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. He moves along the stonework toward the place where the archive keeps its most stubborn silences, ready tomorrow to listen again.